East Street, Episode 14, by Amber Street, Cat and Mouse. When Lenny realized that he had rattled Jack's cage, he knew that he was right in his assumptions about Jack being a cop or a fed. What he didn't know was if Jack was a dirty cop or a dirty federal agent who was dipping into the pot on the side, or if he was undercover. The feds had always been open in their investigations of the family, but that didn't mean that they wouldn't go so low as to put a plant in the family's inner circle. Lenny glanced over at Jack several times during dinner, but Jack never looked back at Lenny. "Gives me indigestion," Lenny said to himself as he wiped his mouth with his napkin and set it on his plate. He stood up and looked at his parents. "I gotta go. I'll see you both in a few days or so." Joey looked at Lenny and quickly wiped his mouth and stood up, even though he wasn't finished eating. "Where are you going?" Genevieve asked Joey. "Oh, well, since Lenny is leaving, I thought that I should too," he said. Genevieve waved her arm and said, "You are like family. Stay." Joey looked over at Lenny. Lenny gave him a stealthy stare and said, "Stay." Jack looked over at Lenny without him noticing. He knew that he was being watched and that Joey was in on it. He wiped his mouth and looked at Joey and Lenny as casually as he could. "Okay, thanks," Joey said. He sat back down. Lenny looked over at Jack and gave him a "don't mess with my family" look. Frederick noticed. He finished chewing and wiped his mouth before he took a sip of red wine. He saw the expression on Jack's face and knew. "He's dirty," Frederick thought to himself. Jack held Lenny's gaze for a moment and grit his teeth. His breath quickened. He was a brave man, but now he was deeply under suspicion, and he knew if he blew this case, his job could be in jeopardy if Lenny didn't kill him first. Lenny saw a moment of fear in Jack's eyes. He gave Jack a cold look and said, "Why don't you come outside with me for a moment, Jack?" Genevieve almost gasped at the request. Lenny had never asked Jack to go outside before. She knew that something was wrong. Genevieve looked at Frederick, who was seated at the head of the table to her right. "What's going on?" she whispered. Frederick reached out his hand and rested it on Genevieve's arm as a way to let her know to remain silent. He nodded his head towards Jack, just as Jack was nodding his head to Lenny and getting up from the table. Jack looked at everyone and nodded his head. "Excuse me." Jack followed Lenny to the back door and stood next to him on the terrace. Lenny looked at the grounds. It was starting to get dark. He looked at Jack and said, "Let's take a walk." Jack nodded. He was not wearing a gun. He never risked it with the family. They were too good at spotting hidden weapons. He walked next to Lenny and followed him down the pathway. It was lit by garden lamps that looked like small, festive, old-fashioned street lamps. Lenny led Jack down the concrete pathway to a small white gazebo. Lenny walked up the steps and sat down on one of the benches. He patted his hand on the bench. "Come sit down." Lenny had a small, satisfied smile on his face. He was enjoying this cat and mouse game, and he was confident that Jack would crumble.